He makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Please be seated. It was surprisingly simple. Jesus placed his hands on the deaf-mute man, and he said, "Be opened." It was not complicated or expensive surgery. It wasn't years of speech therapy or hearing aids or implants, those things that serve us so well today. Jesus simply held the man with compassion as he released him from his burdens. Which tells us that this story wasn't really about medical interventions or even faith healing, but a complete change of life. Each and every one of us knows just a little bit about what it means to be carrying some kind of a burden that keeps us closed off and in a kind of sensory bubble. We may be blessed with hearing and sight, and yet there is so much that we carry that keeps us a little bit isolated from the world that is right around us. Whether those be wounds that we received many years ago, whether that be a toxic relationship that we just can't seem to find our way out of, whether that be the demands and expectations of a culture that just can't seem to figure out what it means to see and honor the dignity in every human being. For each of us, each in our own way, we risk becoming numb to the world around us, to the grace around us, to the goodness and the love of God. If this passage was just about healing, then I think Jesus would have used a different word. I think he would have simply said, "Be healed," or "be better," or "What wonderful music you're going to be able to hear. You'll now hear the rabbi preaching and know what he's talking about." But that's not what he says. He says, "Be opened," which is a little bit different. To me, that means be awake. It means be ready. It means be transformed. Now, that is a word we hear a lot, and we use it a lot here as well. Transformation. Be transformed. But what exactly do we mean when we say it? Does that mean that we are changed into something else entirely? Does it mean giving up who I am? Or worse, does it mean conforming to somebody else's vision of what a better me would look like? You know, if someone says, "I want you to be transformed into something I like a little bit better," that's not a very good deal. Transformation is what happens when we let go of the small self, the false self, the egos, and the feuds and the power plays of this life, and instead anchor our lives on the sacred, spending our lives discerning where the presence of God is around us in hard moments and joyful moments, and anchoring our lives on that, on the generous goodness of God. It means going from fear and all the ways that flows into our lives, from anxiety to avarice to insecurity, all those things, to self-centeredness, and instead going from fear and instead focusing on love, on knowing and proclaiming the reality of love and the kindness and compassion and grace that flows from that. Like the man who could not hear, like the woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit, we say that we want to be healed. We say that we want to see and hear and be free of whatever spirits are moving in us that are not pleasant, but do we really? I mean, really, do we really want to change? Do we want to put in the work? Because it's work that we have to do, and we have to keep coming back to it day in and day out. I mean, how great would it be if this could happen with one magic moment? I mean, if all that it took was the Lord of life taking our faces in his hands, spitting on us. I mean, okay, gross, but at least if it's only once, I'm willing to put up with that, because then it's one and done transformation. Who wouldn't want that? If only the changes that we hunger for could happen that fast, whether in our souls or in our own world. I say this after yet another week where the tragic reality of gun violence has once again come to the surface. And we can look at that and we can say that there is no magic signature that in an instant is going to put an end to our obsession with guns and our culture of alienation, although laws would do a lot to limit the carnage. There is no certificate program that will undo centuries of systemic inequality and racism, although knowledge and norms can help us point the way, at least alert us at the head level that something is deeply amiss at the heart level. In this and in all the knotted challenges that we face, transformation is what we need. Moving from fear to love is what is profoundly necessary, and that comes not through knowledge of facts, but facts matter, so much as a profound change of heart. And the same can be true of our inner lives. This movement from fear to love can and often does take an entire lifetime, and it comes through bravery, through brave conversation, through healing relationships, heartfelt prayer, and trust. Coercion and dominance and posturing never, ever move us from fear to love. Rather, our hearts are opened, they are transformed through a lifetime of prayer and compassion and surrender. Now, it may be hard to believe, we talk about transformation, it may be hard to believe that Jesus actually went through some transformation as well. It's hard to think because we want Jesus to have been Jesus from the very beginning. And it's a little unsettling to think that he too was changed by his interactions with others. We tend to say that, look, if Jesus didn't have it all together in the beginning, I am in a lot of trouble. Because we all are just trying to put it all together. But do you know what? He did. And that's the whole point, I think, of this story, this encounter with the Syrophoenician woman. This woman who is not Jewish, who is not a part of his tribe, and yet had a daughter with an unclean spirit. No, we don't know exactly what that meant, but we do know that a parent was deeply and profoundly concerned for her child, and so she goes up to Jesus with more faith than a great many of his own companions had and said, "Master, help her, help my daughter." And what is so hard to read is that Jesus doesn't help her. Jesus actually says to this woman who is hurting and who asks for his help, no, he won't do it. He says, "Let me take care of my own people first," he says. And bless her for her courage, because she argues with him. She does not take his no for an answer, does she? And she changes him. She turns that no into a yes. And it is the yes whereby God's promise and gift of grace opened up to all people, all children of God. Everything that God has made, every person that God has made, the woman says, needs the healing grace that you bring. Every one of us. And with that, Jesus is changed. Jesus is transformed. Now, do you know what a feedback loop is? This is not a scriptural term. It's kind of corporate speak, buzzwordy, okay? But I'm going to do it anyway. That never stopped me before. A feedback loop is it's when a community or an organization or a city or a body, something organic, has ways of listening and even being changed by information they did not expect and frequently don't want to hear. We are in trouble if we do not have feedback loops, if we've closed ourselves off so that we never hear information that we just kind of don't want to hear. That works for a little while until it absolutely doesn't work at all. We are in trouble if we don't have feedback loops. It's not a good thing for a body. Think about your body, which is an organic thing, that if a body does not register pain or disease, it is not going to survive. Think about that. Pain is the body saying, something is wrong here. And if there's something you can do about it to fix it, I strongly recommend that you do that. It doesn't always work, but that's what pain is. That's even in our own lives, when something is amiss, when we are hurting, there is a reason, and we need to listen to that. Same is true for a city, a community, a nation. If a nation cannot process the raw data or the human toll of school shootings and let that inform our cultural relationship with guns, then the sickness is just going to continue to spread. Jesus' conversation with the Syrophoenician woman tells me something about feedback loops. It tells me that these kinds of conversations with people maybe you're not expecting to hear from are actually vital to the process of transformation. Insights and inspiration will often come not from the familiar groups of people that you're used to talking to, but rather from the edges of life, from the places of pain and even conflict, and from voices of the ones who we don't often hear. And those very moments can be fuel for transformation. Think about this. Think about how different that is. About finding inspiration and energy at the very margins of what feels normal and comfortable. Think about how incredibly different that is from how we experience strength and power in this world. I'll use an example. We're thinking a lot about elections these days, as well we should. How do you win an election? How do you win a primary? You shore up the base. You get the group of people, as many of them as possible, who already have the message, who already have the talking points, and you give them as simple and direct a message that ideally goes straight to the amygdala and keeps everybody right there in the familiar place so they get out and do the thing you need them to do. Maybe that's effective in one way, but this is not transformation. This is not learning and growing from what we learn at the margins. What do we do when we're under fire? We circle the wagons, we close ranks, we move inward toward a defensive center, away from the edges of life, away from those places of courage and vulnerability that are the very places where transformation happens. And when we do that, at our worst, We enact our fear and our anxiety on others, coercing them to do what we want them to do. But even if all we're doing is just retreating and retaining a defensive posture where we're covering our heads and just tensing our bodies up in fear, we're missing out. We're missing out on the grace that comes in those tender and uncertain places and in those conversations, those feedback loops, where we learn things about the grace and glory of God that we would have never have known if we hadn't stopped in those places. We would never meet the Syrophoenician woman, or maybe if we did, we wouldn't hear a word she has to say because we're too busy talking over her. And then, having been changed by that encounter, having been transformed, Jesus then goes and he encounters this man who cannot hear, cannot speak, and for all we know, never has. And Jesus lays his hands on him and he says, "Be opened." Ephatha. Be opened. Hear the word of God. Speak of what you see. Share this. Let your heart be transformed. I wish I could tell you that this kind of transformation really was a one and done thing. That the right pair of hands could lay on your head and the very thing that you want to happen would happen. I wish I could tell you that transformation could come through a program, a church program, a political party, or even a denomination. I have suggestions on all three, but I cannot tell you that transformation is going to come there. Sorry, but no. Transformation, rather, moving from fear into love. It happens differently for each and every one of us, but the gifts of church and cathedral life is that at our best, we are a community that nurtures transformation, that nurtures this beautiful lifelong process. And I'd say it's beautiful because it's lifelong, of moving from fear into a place of abundant love. Not through a program, not through a sermon, so much as through the give and take of being in a community together, through mutual compassion, through nonviolent speech, through mutual and committed relational work, through prayer and worship, through service and study. This week and next, I want to give each of you an opportunity, some have already done it, to speak to us, to let one another know where we find transformation here in this community. Here we learn to speak of the love of God. In Trinity Commons, and we'll learn a little bit about this in a moment, we're going to have easels that list things like prayer and worship and action and life and community so that you can see it and share with one another how this happens in your own life, how in this community you find yourself opened. Be opened. Jesus' miracles tend to be about the senses, about sight, sound, hearing, about taste, about eating food, about being able to rise up and walk once again. But this ultimately is about how we see and hear and perceive the love of God, which to me says it's really about the heart. How our hearts perceive and hold the goodness of the one who created us. How our hearts are the vessels through which we return that goodness to the world that needs it so much. Ephatha, be opened, be transformed.